Winterreise is one of my absolute favorite pieces, holiest pieces, and strangely it was especially one of my favorite pieces when I was in my 20s, and then I left it for a while, and I haven't really done it since then. Many musicians love this piece, and there's a good reason why. It's a very special piece, and the word special isn't even enough. I would call it kind of a limit piece. It's a piece, there are certain pieces you can think of, the Gold Regulations maybe, or Mahler's Ninth Symphony, or the last Beethoven Sonata, Opus 111. They're at the end of some road, some avenue of musical thinking. They're kind of the last word in something. And this is one of those pieces. It's extreme, and it inhabits a very different space from most music. And to sort of talk about it briefly, there's a few kind of threads that help put the piece in place for me. And one of them is kind of really big picture, and it has to do with major and minor. From most of the early classical music existence, from 1100 on, music was in modes. There weren't scales like we have now, not major scales or minor scales, but there were all these what we call church modes. As if you started on each white key of the piano and just went up. And each of those modes had a little bit of major and a little bit of minor in them, what we would call now major and minor. They weren't, they were ambiguous. It wasn't polarized between major and minor, and that element where major and minor got defined and a whole language of music coalesced starts at, say, probably late 1600s, 1700s. And so you have, especially in Bach, this idea that you have major and minor opposed to each other, and a whole new way of composing is derived from this. Actually, in the late 18th century, most music is major. Most classical music, Haydn, Mozart, and the minor is the exception. So you have this music that's mostly happy, bright, and then there are these kind of bits of dark minor coursing through them, where there are certain passages in Mozart where it begins in major or in minor, and then it sort of flickers back and forth between the two. And it's not even like there's a happy part and then there's a sad part, but no, there's this sense of kind of a deep instability at the heart of everything. And it's maybe specifically kind of Viennese ambiguity that happens. I'm thinking of particularly of Mozart, the concerto, one of my favorite pieces, 503, which begins with major chords. And within about 20 seconds from there, you're suddenly in the minor in a completely different world, a completely different kind of music, uneasy, and all the kind of clarity and joy of this opening C major vanishes. And then throughout that entire concerto, he obsessively revisits this switch from major to minor in a way that you never know what the music is actually expressing. He's always pulling the rug out from under you. It's always changing. So, and that thread of this, what can we do with major and minor that makes it more meaningful? That's what begins to be one of Schubert's most amazing obsessions. Occasionally you'll be going through a young Schubert phrase, and then there'll be a painful little note or another, or some sort of twinge of minor, and that's, in young Schubert, it's kind of an effect. It's something that is fascinating in the music and gives it a variety, gives it something. But it's not like yet the meaning. And as Schubert begins to develop through his 20s and the music begins to evolve, it becomes this question of major and minor. Schubert's at this place where this becomes his big obsession. He's composing music about, more or less about this. And he's using this element of music to explore some of the really uncanny emotional worlds within us, some of the darker, more uncertain places of being human. And if I had to say, that's one of the things that is most important. Not just that he wrote amazingly beautiful tunes and ravishing places, but he explores this particular place. And this piece, Winterreise, is the culmination of this search for kind of a maximum instability and flickering. It's also taking up a different thread. There's two pieces of Schubert, big song cycles, and they're both quintessentially romantic pieces. There's Die schöne Müllerin and this one, Winterreise. And Die schöne Müllerin is the story of course, a young miller who falls in love with a nice young girl, and then the hunter comes and takes her away, and he's distraught and he kills himself. It's a tragedy, to be sure, but at least it has a storyline. It has hope at the beginning. The hope is there's some achievement of joy, his pleasure, and he has that wonderful song, Mine, or whatever, in the middle where he thinks that they're going to be together. And then, of course, the hope is dashed. And so there's an arc to it, happiness and destruction of happiness, and then tragedy and suicide, which was a romantic preoccupation. But this piece, Winterreise, begins after the story is more or less over and begins to explore a gradual, which you might even call shades of despair and ways of falling apart and the kind of sights of loss and grief. And so it's a piece that, in a way, doesn't have a story. The story is already in the past. He tried to court this girl. She presumably married someone wealthier than him, and he's wandering now in the aftermath. And there's nothing, in a way, to do but to wander further and further and to visit all the various kinds of grief and despair that he can. And there's a kind of surreal quality, eventually, that the things, as if you have experienced a serious loss in your life, afterwards things don't seem like they used to. Things that you used to enjoy are suddenly seen in almost a kind of a photographic negative, And you have these periods of kind of false euphoria and then periods of deep, deep darkness and anger. All these things, he's visiting all of them. And Schubert is trying to use these somewhat simple poems to create musical reenactments of these elements of loss. So, we begin by walking. He's walking. In the minor. And the first thing he says, the first word the singer says is foreign or a stranger. I am a stranger, fremd. So, and the whole first song is about this walking, and what's so relevant to what I was saying before is that he normalizes for you this sense of the minor, this incredible sense of sadness, treading in this tragic. But then what you don't expect is that when he switches into the major, that turns out to be the most heartbreaking part, that he's created a world in which the major is worse than the minor. He's reversed the polarity of the whole musical language. And that's kind of what he's after in so many of these pieces, this sort of uncanny place where the music is reversing expectations or undermining what you would normally imagine happiness and sadness to be. And you have this, so as I said, different kinds of despair. Some of them are quite agitated. This kind of restless searching, something that is, and then you'll have a kind of almost insane, almost looking forward to Mahler and Shostakovich folk song that. And he manages to create these tunes that have a kind of, and then he switches down. Folk tunes that have a weirdly disturbing, they sound like normal folk tunes, but somehow the way he's composed them, they partake of something much, much darker under this. Even the very famous song, Frühlingstraum. Which hopefully Eric will sing better. And inevitably he set up a world now where even this kind of blissful melody, which in earlier Schubert would have been something like Paradise, you're waiting for the sword to fall, for everything to turn dark, and indeed it does. One of my most dreaded favorite songs in this piece is the Crow, which has the most withering and upsetting text, where he says a crow is following him. He's walking along, a crow, of course, symbol of death. It's been following him since the town, I seem to remember. My German translation is a little rusty. It keeps following him, and he writes this just unbelievably uncanny. The singer sings, the narrator, and the pianist is tracing the singer like the crow, following him note for note. And it's at the end of this song that the great poetic payoff happens, that he says, this is finally, the crow will follow me until I basically die, and until I fall dead on the road, and that at least will be faithfulness until the grave. That's pretty dark, and yet there's several more songs yet more dark and weird to go after that. That's only number 15, you know. So, and what he's after, many people like to compare this piece to Samuel Beckett, and I think that is one of the best comparisons one can make, where you're dealing with a person so beyond hope that you enter this realm where suffering is kind of seen in all these weird lights. And towards the end, we return to the wandering theme, this, like the first song, kind of walking. And that song is quite amazing, and especially at the end when he keeps walking, and then this amazing, the singer remains on the same note. The harmonies underneath change. Master stroke is this still walking notes, right? And these notes that appear on either side, one way low in the keyboard, one a little bit higher. And the singer is still going on the same note. And you hear that from both sides, the harmony is closing in on the singer, wedging in closer and closer as if kind of crushing him. And the last song, of course, famously, is about the organ grinder on a barefoot organ grinder on this hurdy-gurdy on the ice. So that in a way, it's even darker than the rest, but there's a sense that he's removing himself from the story where it's not really even a story anymore. It's just surrendering itself to this kind of nameless human suffering. I've often thought, because this piece has a deep attraction to me, it had a deep attraction to many musicians, to the Romantics. What's the attraction of something so dark and miserable? And it's, I guess the thing is, it feels like it captures certain elements of the human experience that we all know, but we are mostly unwilling to talk about or unable to talk about. And that this piece does it and faces it.